Welcome today to Inflation When Prices Rise. This is the first Get Savvy, Grow Your Green Stuff webinar of the 2022-2023 academic year. And obviously, we're going to be talking about inflation today. This is being recorded, so if you need to hop off, if you need to go somewhere, if you have to leave early, that's completely fine. If you've registered, we have your email address and we will email you the recording once it's available. My name is Andrea Pellegrini, and I run the Student Money Management Center for the entire University of Illinois system out of University Bursar, and I'm joined today by my friend Chase Raywinkle in IDFPR. Chase, do you want to say hi and introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, thank you. My name is Chase Raywinkle. I'm excited on this topic today. I'm the Director of Banking for the state of Illinois, but I am an economist by training. I was previously the Chief Economist for the State Controller, and before that, the Director of Policy for the State Treasurer. So excited to talk about this today.
We are so lucky that Chase, our very good economist friend, is here to co-present today. And Nikki Giancola Shakes, who also works with Chase, helped a lot on the slides, and so we want to give a shout out to her hard work today. Additionally, I would like to remind everyone that the Get Savvy team represents organizations across the state of Illinois, which rests on the lands of multiple Native nations. We would like to recognize and acknowledge that we primarily serve the state of Illinois, and the organizations that we work for reside on ancestral lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasha nations. And we have a responsibility to acknowledge these Native nations and to work with them as we move forward as a vibrant and inclusive society. So with that in mind, I know I explained how to use the chat quite a bit before we started recording. I want you to tell us in the chat what state and or county you're logging in from today, because we want you to be really comfortable with that chat. So someone's coming in from Iowa, that's fabulous. Even though we target Illinois, we sometimes get our neighbors and friends from across the United States to join. So we got Champaign, Illinois, Ohio, McLean County, Illinois, Washington, New Mexico, Minnesota, all over the place, Bloomington, New York. Wow, this is fabulous. Mississippi, wonderful. Keep those coming. So we're going to continue moving forward with the slides just because we have so much to cover. So today we're going to talk about what inflation is. We're going to talk a little bit about how inflation is measured and who measures it. We're also going to explore ways that inflation impacts consumers and ways that we can manage the impacts of inflation as consumers. And then we're going to discuss inflation and the economy a little bit. And we do want to stress that we'll be discussing very basic aspects of inflation today, but it's an extremely complicated topic. So economics as a whole field of study just has inflation as one component, and it's measured and studied in a variety of ways. So we just want to keep that in mind as we talk today. And I'm going to hand it back over to Chase to talk about what inflation is.
Thank you. And just before we move on to the next slide, just to hit on that point as we go forward, if you're interested in economics at all, I would encourage you actually to look into inflation first as a topic. You can teach an entire graduate level class on just inflation. You could specialize on just inflation. There are many economists that just do that. It is a fascinating topic. It can be a scary topic, but I think it's interesting to anybody who kind of has that itch on economics and public policy. So I think it's we're going to just touch on basic points here, but if you have any interest in this area, I encourage you to go look this up. this is one of the more interesting topics I think you can study in economics. So let's talk about what inflation is. So the definition is the general upward price movement of goods and services in the economy. Now, that might seem kind of basic, but we'll see how that plays out. But basically, it's meaning that the goods that you once had were cost more than they did previously. So we'll see how that has economic impacts. Next slide. And you can see that here with this example from bushels of corn. So you can see that in the 1960s, a bushel of corn was $1. And generally, over time, it has risen and risen and risen to where it has gotten into the $5 to $8 range in more recent years. Now, you'll notice that that is not a steady growth. There are different impacts on what causes inflation that we'll go into. But the general trend for goods over in most commercial situations has been up over time. Next slide. There's a lot of measurements for inflation. It can be very challenging to measure inflation. So multiple places try to collect data in order to dictate what inflation is and try to provide policymakers with a good indication of where inflation is going. The Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Analysis keep their own indicators, and we will go through some of these indicators because they have their pluses and their minuses, and you can see when you're looking forward what that means for you. All right, so let's talk first about the Consumer Price Index, CPI, and there are multiple versions of this. But if you're reading in a newspaper or you're online or something, this is probably the indicator that you most often associate with inflation. And basically, this measures a change in consumer prices based on a list of a set of goods. And that we call a basket of goods. There are a lot of different items within this, everything from orange juice prices to gold to oil and energy costs, medical costs are in there. And the CPI can be divvied up across different prices of different types of goods. You can have energy in there or out, food in there or out, things like that. CPI is a good general quick gauge on whether prices are increasing in a particular area or overall throughout the economy. There are some drawbacks, though, with just looking at the CPI. The CPI is looked at as a basket of goods going back so you can compare 2022 to 1985. The problem, though, is the value that we place in our society on some of those goods have changed since then. Think about computers. Computers in the 1980s were not as important as they are now. And so when you have prices around baskets of goods, sometimes there can be quirks in them that might not be capturing inflation as well as it's capturing something else within consumption. It is tied to prices, so in effect, it has an inflationary process. But it's good to know how the Consumer Price Index and how consumer price indices in general are pulled together using baskets of goods. Next slide. So you can also look at producer costs, not just consumption, and these are basically prices paid to U.S. producers for goods and services, known as wholesale costs. They're weighted differently, and you have, though, kind of the same sort of historical problem when looking at those type of indices. But it's important to look also from the producer side as when we go into what causes inflation by not just looking at the CPI, but also looking at producer prices. Next one. And then you have stuff like import and export prices. If you understand how gross domestic product is calculated, you'll know that that's actually based on not just consumption, private consumption, and government consumption, as well as investments, but also net import exports. So the prices of those also change and can increase inflation because they are increasing price costs. For instance, especially when you're talking about, we'll go over here in a second on producer-related costs, you have items like microchips that we don't make as much here in the United States. We import those. If those increase in price, that's going to impact prices overall that are associated with those microchips here in the United States, causing some inflationary measures. So just important there. And then lastly, next slide. Yep. Lastly, we'll do the GDP price deflator. This I actually think is probably the strongest measurement if you're trying to divorce yourself from that basket of goods concept. So the GDP price deflator is actually a measurement of nominal GDP over real GDP. It's supposed to dictate kind of that just raw change in purchasing power between prices. It can be complicated though. And if you study how gross domestic product is calculated, since we're doing this at such a large level, you can be missing certain inputs and outputs within that measurement. It also is very difficult to capture on a day-to-day basis. A lot of inflation measurements are. And that means that a lot of these indicators are lagging, making it difficult for policymakers to kind of make those decisions in real time. So those are some of the measurements. So let's talk about what causes inflation. There are two primary causes of inflation, and we have terms for them. You have cost pull inflation. That's when production costs are driving up prices. So for instance, a material becomes rarer. Let's talk about our microchip situation. We have a global pandemic. It is more difficult to send microchips over to the United States. So things like cars, computers, anything with a microchip in there, believe it or not, refrigerators and things like that these days, they are going to drive up in price because the raw materials and somewhat finished materials that go into those even super finished goods are going up. So if wood becomes more difficult because of a supply chain issue, or coal, or any other of those raw materials, steel, that will impact the overall price of that item. Effectively, because it's rarer. If you think about basic consumption, even if there is a demand for that good, if you're artificially, or not even artificially, but if that good is becoming rarer, the scarcity of that good will drive up that price because people are willing to pay more or can pay more for something that is rarer and therefore not everybody can have. So that's the situation with cost pull inflation. Then you have demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is when demand is outpacing production. Usually we refer to this as there's too much money in the system. So let's go back to our pandemic conversation, which is kind of getting at why we might be in an inflationary period right now, is that if people are getting rebates or they're having tax refunds or something like that, and that's putting more cash into the hands of consumers, they're going to use that cash, and because they have more ability to use those dollars in the system, that's going to drive up basic prices. If I am limited in my ability to buy certain things because I only have $20 to spend on let's say discretionary spending, if that gets doubled to $40, that puts more dollars in the system to buy those discretionary pieces, which will drive up the cost for discretionary goods overall. So that's why you have these both poles. And in a lot of ways, both of these types of causes of inflation can happen at the same time. You can see in our pandemic issue, supply chain issues cause a scarcity in certain goods, so the price of those goes up. For instance, building homes, the prices of raw materials to build homes have created kind of a price jump in that area. And then you also see demand pull inflation, where people are able to spend more money because of, let's say, tax rebates, or because they're not spending as much money on travel because they aren't going into the office every day. Those dollars in those systems are also going to drive up prices. I'm going to turn it back to Andrea for the next section.
Thank you so much, Chase. I think that we all have learned a lot just from the first section from you sharing with us. Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inflation's impact specifically on consumers. And so I'm going to try to launch a poll here. It's been a while since I launched a poll, but let's see what I can do. Launch a poll. So where have you felt inflation the most recently? Has it been in housing or food or transportation, utilities, maybe something else that we hadn't thought about? Where do you feel like you have felt the impacts of inflation recently? A lot of people are feeling it in food. Oh, there's quite a few in transportation as well. I'll give you a couple more seconds. Go ahead.
And I saw, since we're doing a poll, I saw a question in the chat. Would the price of helium increase be an example of cost pull inflation? I think that's a good example. Helium is limited in its source, so since it's scarcer, the price will go up as that becomes even more scarce in our environment. There are probably also supply chain issues with that as well, but I think that makes some sense from that perspective.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that chat question. So I've stopped the poll, and it looks like 90% of you have felt the effects of inflation in food, 66% in transportation, 49% in utilities, 22% in housing, and 77% in other places. But those grocery costs, we've noticed in my household, have really gone up lately. So I think we are all on the same page there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about purchasing power. Purchasing power refers to the amount of goods and services that one unit of currency can buy at a given point of time. Inflation takes away your purchasing power of currency over time. So for example, we're going to come back to that corn example that we had earlier. $1 could buy about a bushel of corn, a whole bushel, in 1960. Now, as of 2022, $1 can buy maybe a sixth of a bushel of corn. So that one unit of currency has gone down, or the purchasing power for corn specifically of that $1 has gone down quite a bit in the past 50 years. So that's just one example of how it can impact. Oh, I got a little too excited with my slides here. All right, so in addition to our purchasing power, this graph shows the monthly change in prices for personal expenses between September of 2021 and July of 2022. As you can see, energy goods and services spiked in March, but then it came down significantly in April, then went back up in June. And food costs have gone up, and other personal expenses, not including food and energy, have stayed relatively steady over the past year. There's been a little bit of jumping around, but this graph is just here to show that the types of expenses that we have that could be subject to the impacts of inflation can vary. And it's not just the impact of inflation that's having an impact on these different types of costs. For example, energy is impacted by technology and discovery and new developments in those spaces all the time, which is not specifically inflation, but it does impact prices. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Recently, I keep bumping my slides. I'm so sorry. So recently, both new and used car prices have gone up, which means that consumers have to borrow more to afford a vehicle. This will increase monthly costs and long-term debt, which can also impact your ability to build wealth. So that inflation cost, specifically on the costs of car ownership, impacts lots of aspects of your personal financial well-being and wealth building. For example, Chase brought up the microchip shortage that the pandemic caused, and that's having this ripple effect on the cost of cars as well. So this graph shows the CPI for all urban consumers for both new and used vehicles between August of 2021 and August of 2022. And as you can see, that percent change has been quite a bit over the past year.
And you can see how those impacts are on both new cars and old cars. So the impact obviously on new cars is there's less, the materials to make that car have become rarer. So the newer cars themselves have become rarer, driving up their price. But that in turn has an impact on used cars. They're already over here, but since there's a rarity in the new cars, that people will more have to go to the used car market, which drives up prices there.
Absolutely. And people are hanging on to their cars longer, which means there's less older cars being sold as well because they're not buying new cars. So that impacts several levels, socioeconomic levels, depending on how much money you have to buy a car as well. So thank you for adding to that, Chase. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about what the federal interest rate hikes mean later, but I'm going to talk now about what it means to individual consumers. So when the Federal Reserve increases the interest rates, what happens is mortgage rates will go up, home sales will often go down, auto loan rates will also go up, credit card rates will go up, even just within a couple month cycles after the Federal Reserve makes changes to the interest rate. Private student loan rates will also go up, and the one benefit is that saving rates will go up, but it's usually just a little bit. So there's a lot more potential negative things that can happen in the consumer space when interest rate hikes occur. So, and now we'll talk a little bit about shrinkflation. So shrinkflation is when a company reduces the quantity or quality of ingredients included in a product to combat the impacts of inflation. So this occurs during inflation times, obviously, and when there's lower consumer demands. And one of the best examples of shrinkflation is by a tissue company. And according to an article by Investor Place, a small box of Kleenex now has 60 tissues, whereas a few months ago it only had as many as 65 tissues. There are other examples of how shrinkflation has occurred over the years. For example, how many chips are in chip bags over time, or how much soda is in a bottle of Coke from now versus periods in history. Some restaurant chains have adjusted how many fries are in your fry order, for example. And Chase, do you want to share your example about Baker's Dozen?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is kind of an interesting concept within shrinkflation. Now, there's a lot of other political history within this, but I always find this an interesting example. So as I'm sure you know, a baker's dozen is 13, not 12. So where did we get that from? You get a lot of back history on this, but a number of folks believe this comes back from Middle Ages in Britain, and around the idea that as prices rise and different bakers were trying to save money or make money off of their profession, there was a history of them cutting out and maybe making smaller some of their baking orders. This created an issue that created a lot of new laws in the United Kingdom, which actually meant that if bakers were found skimping out on the size and weight of their baked goods, they could be, in some cases, publicly beaten, which is kind of crazy. And so instead, bakers decided to add, in a lot of cases, a 13th item to a dozen, just to make sure that they were avoiding that kind of penalty. So you kind of see the reverse of shrinkflation there, in that because of earlier attempts by individuals to kind of shrink down the product that they were offering, laws were instituted, and that caused a dramatic effect on the other end, so much due to this day that we now have the term baker's dozen.
Thank you, Chase. I thought that was a very interesting little history fact related to inflation. So in addition to shrinkflation and the other impacts of inflation, it's important to recognize that it does not impact everyone the same way. For instance, low-income families and low-income individuals are often harder hit by the impacts of inflation than higher income families or individuals. For example, families who can't afford a savings account have nothing to dip into during a time of inflation. Lower income families often devote more of their wages to necessities like food and housing. So, for example, someone that normally eats yogurt from brand A in times of inflation go with yogurt brand B because brand B is cheaper. They have some flexibility in their income. For low income and people in poverty, they always only had the option of yogurt B, so they may go without yogurt. They might have food insecurity or housing insecurity because of the impacts of inflation on their ability to obtain necessities. So it's important to recognize that. In addition, the impacts of inflation are different on whether you live in a rural community or an urban community. So a lot of the graphs that we've showed today have had like the consumer price index for urban consumers, right? Because urban costs are a little bit different. Urban supply is also a little bit different. And so that's one aspect of how it can impact people differently. Another thing is by age. So younger individuals are less likely to have built up a savings to handle loss of income or transitions through times of higher inflation as well. Or people that are older that might have fixed income, they may not get what we call a cost of living adjustment in time to cover the entire cost of their groceries or their healthcare costs due to the cost of inflation. So we've put several examples of how the impacts of inflation do not impact everyone equally in the chat. So you can learn a little bit more about that if you are interested. All right, let's talk a little bit about how to manage the impacts of inflation. We've talked about the costs, we've talked about kind of what it is. Let's talk about managing it. So I want you to put in the chat, what do you think consumers can do to manage the impact of inflation based on what we've talked about so far today? Can you put that in the chat? It might be a little challenging to think about. I think we've illustrated that inflation is a challenging topic, but what do you think consumers can do to manage that impact of inflation? feel like I need some Jeopardy music when we're thinking about what consumers can do. Well, I'm going to have you keep thinking about that, but I'm going to keep moving forward. Oh, we have pay off debt. We have spend less. All right. Any other ideas? Focus on necessities, cut down on less essential spending, use more coupons or shop at cheaper places, take public transportation if available, comparison shopping, examining what your spending is like and looking to improve your spending based on what might be most impactful is very good. Change your goals. That might be a little bit difficult, but that can definitely, you might have to put off some of your goals. All right, so you guys have some great ideas, and that's pretty much what we're going to talk about. So a lot of what you can do to manage inflation is around your behaviors. So looking at shopping around at different locations, you want to compare prices, look for indications of shrinkflation, right? If the brand you usually get starts putting less in a package and you notice that, that's an important aspect of comparison shopping. Look for other unit prices that can help you save some money. You might look at buying in bulk versus at convenience stores, especially for students on campus. It's a lot easier to go to the convenience store to get a snack, but it's going to be a lot cheaper to buy your snacks in bulk and then just plan ahead to put a couple snacks in your book bag when you go to class. You might look at bills that can be lowered or cut. Look at the amount of streaming services you have. Maybe you look for discounts that you're eligible for those streaming services. For instance, student discounts. Insurance, you might have a group discount based on your employer. You might be able to make some adjustments with your car insurance or your home insurance to help lower some of those bigger costs. You might even ask for a raise or look for a higher paying job as well. So there are a lot of other ways to manage inflation. And like I think a few of you in the chat said, you might have to delay your goal. Like for instance, delaying a vacation goal or delaying a goal to buy a new car or make an update to your house. So there are different ways to deal with inflation. And I'm going to hand it over to Chase to talk about how the government fights inflation.
Thanks. So yes, and everything you can do to try to help your balance sheet and your bills will help you kind of weather in high inflationary periods. But at the end of the day, inflation and how to attack inflation and its root causes are very challenging for individuals to be able to fix. And in most cases, it's governments and markets that dictate how inflation resolves. It can resolve over time. I wouldn't call it naturally, but because of how markets behave over time. And then also some policies can be put in place that can impact inflation. We have three things listed here. I'm going to start first with the Illinois General Assembly and our governor, as well as Congress and the president, because they kind of act in similar ways. So here in Illinois, in order to try to combat some of the inflation, the state had tried to cut down on fees and rebate and provide rebates on some services and taxes here in order to make sure that people that were suffering because of inflation had more dollars in their system so that they could afford higher costs of goods. Now, you might have said, well, hang on, I remember one of the causes of inflation is too many dollars. Won't that increase inflation here? And you can certainly argue that, but I think it's important to understand that cutting kind of fees and stopping things like sales tax on certain items, that impacts the lowest income individuals more than the higher income folks, because they have to use, and this is called a concept called the marginal propensity to consume. So for every dollar that somebody on the lower end of the income spectrum has, they will use the majority of that dollar immediately to buy goods that they need as necessities: food, clothing, shelter, transportation. Whereas on the higher income, more of that dollar, that extra dollar, will go towards savings and investments. So they're going to be impacted more dramatically by raises in prices over those necessities. So in some ways, these kind of procedures to get more ability for those individuals to pay helps them in the short term to be able to afford some of those rising prices. And a similar thing can be said about what Congress and the president have done around the Inflation Reduction Act to try to cut down on some costs to energy, things like that, but also make sure that there were some more ability for those that are most impacted by inflation to be able to afford those price increases. But while those pieces are happening, the other policy measure that really is the direct attack on rising inflation rates is from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve System, which is a fairly unique system in the world, is essentially our central bank, and one of their duties is to control inflation. They have what's called a dual mandate, that is keeping unemployment low and keeping inflation under control. They have targets for those individual items. Now, how they control inflation, which they can't just suddenly say prices are going to drop. They don't cap prices on products. What instead they do is which is called raising the federal funds rate, which is the overnight lending rate between banks. So the Federal Reserve lends, it has a discount window, it lends to banks, and then it controls the rate at which banks, basically setting a floor or ceiling, a floor on the borrowing rates between banks. That in turn means that those banks have to change their interest rates when they're lending out in the normal market. So that if the federal funds rate is raised, then interest rates in general for banks rise. Now, why would you do this? Rising interest rates takes more money out of the system, and therefore decreases the money supply, which will eventually, in most cases, bring down prices. So that's why the Federal Reserve raises the federal funds rate, to raise interest rates during a period of high inflation. So you can see this is a graph of the percentage increases with the federal fund rate over time, and that has you can see that there are dramatic impacts over the early 80s there, and that has a lot to do with some lingering recession there, also in the 70s. But if you notice, since 2009-ish, 2008, we haven't seen an increase really at all. And that is kind of stemming out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. Well, 2007 is when it started. And so we have had these low rates essentially for a market generation, and now we're starting to see those increase again, and that'll have longer impacts on inflation, but as our economy overall. All right. Oops, sorry. In my notes. So I think we next want to do, so what does inflation cause a recession? And I didn't know if we wanted to do, or we were doing a poll question here. But in the chat, do you think inflation causes inflation or not? Anyone?
Don't worry, you're not being graded on it.
Yeah.
We're just
There no.
curious what you think. Maybe
I
sometimes.
like the answer sometimes.
Yeah.
Saw that. Okay. Well, we'll get there. I know that's a kind of a scary question. So next slide. Yeah, sometimes is kind of the answer. So I appreciate the people that put that in. What you're looking at is the CPI for all urban consumers in the United States. This is the city average. This is usually a measurement that is reported when people are talking about inflation. And then the gray areas are recessions. You can see in a lot of recessions, there are spikes of the CPI. So inflation was rising, but not all the time. And it's important to understand that inflation can cause recession, but it doesn't always match up. And that goes to kind of what a recession is. So let's just go to the definition of a recession real quick. It's a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and industrial activity are reduced, generally identified by a fall in GDP in 2 successive quarters. That last part is really important. It is the technical definition of a recession. You can have a discussion about whether or not a recession is taking place from a atmospheric perspective. You're thinking, hey, it really feels like from a consumer perspective, we're in a recession. But the technical definition for a recession is a fall in GDP in 2 successive quarters. So if we go to the next slide, recessions are complicated, like inflation is complicated. Economics in general is complicated. There's a lot of things that can be a driver on a recession. And since GDP is a measurement of output, anything that has an impact on our economic output is a possible cause of a recession. Inflation does have an impact on output. It impacts our consumption. It impacts our ability to invest in other items long term. It really changes how our economy works. And so when you have more money in the system, you can cause issues where output decreases. And so that could cause a recession, but not all the time. And in high inflation environments, there have been periods where a recession did not get triggered, even though there was a high inflationary period. You can see here, and this is another possible cause of a recession, which is unemployment. You can see a measurement between unemployment and inflation here, seen through the CPI. You'll notice that they are a little bit opposed to each other. So in periods of high unemployment, you see kind of less inflation and vice versa. You can kind of make sense of that in that, if there's more people with jobs, they're spending more money. That puts more money into the system that can cause inflation. And with less people having jobs, then the opposite could be true. Now, for a long time in economic studies, it was seen that these were 2 hard opposition to each other, that there could not be a period of time where there was both low unemployment and low inflation, or vice versa. There couldn't be periods of high inflation and high unemployment. That's not true. It has happened, probably most famously in the 1970s with some of the oil increases during Jimmy Carter's presidency. That was a period known as stagflation, where you had both high unemployment and you had high inflation. So unfortunately, those can happen at the same time. And then this was a really interesting graph that the New York Times put together. Andrea had it, and it basically charted recessions along inflation rates and unemployment. You can go on the New York Times and look at this. But you can see that the story is complex. There are periods of time where inflation might be causing some of our output issues. There's a period of time where unemployment might be causing some of our recession issues. It's interesting to look at that. It's not always the case here with recessions and booms. Then I will go to another area that kind of hands off to another presentation that I know is going to be happening around investing. And one of the interesting factors around inflation is an area called interest rate risk. And so I am a bank regulator. We look at a lot of our institutions, and banks on their balance sheets hold large assets from time to time to help balance out what their lending is. And the inflation can have a side effect on some of these assets. So as the Federal Reserve seeks to raise interest rates to combat inflation, this can cause increases in other investment rates. Obviously, you can see securities increase in their interest rates. That's part of this combating of inflation. But that also means that your currently held investments will lose market value. So let's say I had a bond that was paying a 3% yield. This is very basic. And now interest rates have raised and new bonds are being produced of similar vintage, and they have 4 and 5% interest rates on them. Well, it's going to be more difficult for me to sell that 3% bond just because it doesn't have the same value. And this is a downside risk to your investment portfolio potentially during an inflationary period. And that can have longer implications on the investment economy. It can impact your retirement savings and things like that because there are these adjustments to those investments happening at the same time.
All right, thank you so much, Chase. So we're going to be talking about investing risks and rewards next February 8th at noon, just as all of our Get Savvy, Grow Your Green Stuff webinars are. So we'll be talking about maybe a little about interest rate risk and other types of risks related to investing, as well as some of the benefits of investing. So make sure to sign up for that. And thank you, Ramya, for putting that in the chat. We just want to summarize kind of what we've talked about today. Basically, inflation is an increase in the cost of goods. It is one of many economic indicators. You can't say that inflation is always going to be causing a recession or vice versa. The government does try to influence inflation through legislation and with the Federal Reserve, interest rates as well. And it impacts all consumers differently, depending on where they are in life and kind of their socioeconomic status, among other things like age, like we talked about earlier. Our next webinar is Side Hustles and Small Businesses, which we will be doing on October 26th. And Steve Bob, who I believe is in our participant list today, will be co-presenting on that. And we're very excited about that. You can watch previously recorded webinars for the Get Savvy series on YouTube, which we will also post. Someone just asked if this video will be available somewhere. We will post it on this YouTube site. So if you want to bookmark it or follow us on YouTube, you can do that. If you registered for this event, we will be emailing it once it is available and all processed. And then please stay in contact with us. And if you have any questions, we will stick around for a little while. We ended a little bit earlier than we usually do, but if you do have to go somewhere, you have to go to class, you have to get back to work, you have to go get lunch, please go ahead and do so. But we'll stick around for a little bit to answer any questions that you might have. So someone asked if we are sharing the slides. We always make a PDF of the slides. Ramya, can you put the link to the slides in the chat again for Desiree? So we have a PDF of the slides. We'll also include the PDF of the slides when we send the webinar recording as well via email. So make sure that you have registered. All right. We did have a question about the corn examples. So someone asked if we were talking about human edible sweet corn or field corn for livestock, and said that the current value is $6.16 for field corn, from Carol. So we used the I believe the price index just for all corn, so it's likely the livestock feed corn, and what's used in other products as well for the bushel of corn.
Was that the Bureau of Labor Statistics where you pulled that from?
I think it was the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
It'll probably be both, most likely.
Yeah. All right, I'm searching just in case there are other questions. So we have another question from Carol. Because the cost of energy impacts most all consumer products, can you clarify what part that plays out in responding to inflation? Do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, go ahead. Or did you want me? Sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
You're the economist.
Yeah. No. And no, it's a great question. So energy costs can have a really hard impact on inflation across the economy. Like we said, with that period of stagflation where you had unemployment and rising inflation, that was actually due to energy costs rising. And it's true, rising energy costs will impact pretty much every consumer good that exists there, because we have an interconnected and global economy as well as an interstate economy. Chicago doesn't grow the corn that it's eating. It's grown elsewhere, and there's a cost to rising there. So a lot of policymakers, when dealing with rising energy costs, will try to either provide some benefits to cut down on consumer costs with that energy, or try to streamline that better. But yes, those energy costs can be very difficult to control during inflationary periods, and those will have a dramatic effect during that part. So when you're dependent on a decline in raw resources with energy costs, if you cannot control the ability of those prices to decline, it's going to be very difficult to get that under control.
And one question that I had when I was pulling all the graphs and preparing some of the slides for today is whether or not gas was included in the energy costs, and it is for CPI and several other of the economic indicators that we went over, the metrics that we went over. I'm just checking to see if we have any more questions. All right. We do have kind of a political stance question I don't think we can answer. So we'll just.
Oh, yep, I see that one. And honestly, I'm not in a position to be able to judge that question, but I guarantee you there are a lot of good papers and stuff out there discussing, whether it's the presidential administration or a certain state's administration, or even another nation's impact on energy policy on inflation. So, but yeah, I don't think I'd be able to answer that one.
Yeah. But there's a lot of great questions. I appreciate everyone that participated in the chat. And if you happen to have questions later, you can go ahead and email studentmoney@uillinois.edu, and we will for sure try to get you an answer or get you resources that you can get your own answer, because inflation is a very challenging topic and it touches so many different aspects of our society. So we may not have the answer, but we can definitely try to get you something to help you.